So, Erika, first of all, I have to say welcome back to the podcast since you've been on a couple of times. And I'm really excited to get some of your thoughts today on a lot of ESG topics. So, first of all, thank you and for taking the time to come on, and welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's nice.
So, Erika, could you tell us what your current role is at Exiger?
So I just recently actually was appointed, I guess about 6 months ago, to be the global head of our third-party and supply chain risk management solutions team. And with that, it's primarily focused on corporates, although, we have a long history of financial institutions as well. And we are talking to them about their third-party risk management programs, and mostly even around supply chain risk management, which is such a hot topic today.
So if I could turn to ESG, which is obviously a wide and diverse topic, driving with lots of different focuses within the market. But when you speak to your clients or prospective clients, what are either some of the things you're talking to them about, or perhaps the questions they're bringing back to you in your area of expertise?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting conversation because, like you said, ESG is a really hot topic. And what I hear mostly and what I read about mostly is really about how companies are evaluating themselves or how investors are evaluating companies and what they are doing for their people, for their community, where they're doing business specifically. But when the people that I speak to are the ones who are the gatekeepers of the third parties, and, they're getting questions from their stakeholders, which is great. And it is more of an evolving new question that's being asked is like, okay, that's great that we're doing these things. We're still trying to figure out what our values are. How are we, helping our employees or our communities or the environment as a whole? But these third parties are an extension of us. And so are we holding them accountable in any way? And are they following our values? And so that's been an interesting question because you're thinking about, okay, well, what is a procurement person's job? They're really trying to facilitate the business, try and help bring in third parties as fast as they can to help them, grow their business. And, it's been an interesting conversation to see, well, how can Exiger help to think about not just what are they evaluating them on from a business perspective, but also from this kind of more ethical and values-based perspective.
One of the things that has been interesting to me, Erika, is many companies around ESG have been asking for either government guidance, regulation, or some other signals from the government on standards they should follow. The SEC last week, I think, proposed standards around climate risk, but we're talking about supply chain risk. And as you mentioned, both the government and stakeholders, such as customers, such as employees or others, are also driving this discussion around the supply chain. So how have you been talking to, counseling, or working with clients to help them meet a standard which frankly doesn't exist?
That's right. The framework doesn't really exist, but what I think I try to remind our customers are, especially the ones that they're already doing something. The question is just that they're not calling it ESG. So for example, there's a lot of compliance regulation that already exists and kind of guiding of how third parties should behave. For example, bribery and corruption. That is something that they've been looking at agents and distributors for a long time. Now what we are seeing is new regulation coming out in terms of forced labor. That clearly is something that we do not want as in our third parties as well as our supply chains. So there are certain things that companies are already doing. We can also look at some of the information they're already gathering that is an indicator potentially of ESG risk. For example, they're already assessing them from a financial perspective. No one wants to do business with a company that might go bankrupt. If the company has poor credit, it could be an indicator that they're not going to be able to invest in certain ESG programs. They may be more likely to do, something that is not so good in order to keep their business afloat, et cetera. So there's a lot of stuff that companies are already doing. They're just not bucketing it into an ESG label. So step one is kind of seeing, what do you already have? What is the data that already exists, and bringing it into one place? That is another big issue. Is there in these companies, you have the financial team, they're doing that financial perspective. You have the compliance team, they're looking at the compliance and maybe sanctions, which all kind of could fall into an ESG space. And then as there are analysts doing due diligence, and it's thinking about what other information could they be pulling into that due diligence. In the process is already there. And so I would say, yes, there is no exact answer and framework, but I think step one is looking at what you already have, bringing it into one place. Let's have like a cockpit, potentially with the procurement team, who's always the first to be asked, what is our third party doing? You're the one responsible. You're the gatekeeper. Letting them have more access to all of this information, bringing it into one place. And then once you've kind of organized yourself, start thinking about your values and some of those nuanced company-specific ESG topics that you might be interested in, for example, carbon emission, et cetera.
That's a great point that I try to talk about, which is you're doing a lot of ESG right now. You just don't call it ESG. And you ticked off several examples, even just with the supply chain. You're looking at it from a financial perspective. You're looking at adding it from a QA/QC perspective. You may be looking at it from a safety perspective. You're certainly looking at it from a cost perspective. I interviewed a tax expert a couple of weeks ago, and he told me you have to look at it from the tax perspective. So you're looking at it from a variety of disparate sources that may be siloed within an organization. So maybe the first step is, okay, as you said, let's put it all in a cockpit. And from there, then we can begin to take the next step, which is really the question I wanted to ask you, because you've talked about the gatekeepers several times. You talk about procurement. When I was in the corporate world, we called that supply chain, and those gatekeepers. And they're being asked to do, frankly, new and different things. And if we can get everything in the cockpit, how do we keep them from literally being overwhelmed with information? Are there technological or other solutions or even different ways to look at it that you either advocate or counsel clients on to help them then, after they've gathered the data, begin to make sense of it?
Absolutely. So Exiger actually did a study recently with a company called Stacks LLC. And I was surprised to learn from that study that there was 30% of respondents had noted that they're planning to assess all third parties for environmental risk components of ESG within 3 years. So they're thinking about it, but they haven't started doing that yet. The other piece that I pulled out of that report was many institutions reported they had not yet established basic aspects of a program to manage their third-party risk. So that is just the basics, right? And 35% of respondents had stated that they had established tech-enabled solutions to manage risk, with a further 42 saying they are still in the process of implementation. So I think with all of this information that we're talking about and seeing where people are today and how they're doing it, many are still doing it manually, managing via email, managing with Excel. The only way to do all of this, you have to start talking to technology. A lot of the companies I'm even speaking to are saying they want to build it themselves. And that's fine. But if you really think about it, it would be easier if someone has already gotten really good at aggregating certain data, building a risk model, trying to answer these questions that everyone is trying to answer. It would be much easier just to purchase that, as you go to third parties anyway, for that specialized expertise to bring it together. And I definitely think that technology is the only way to go. We're in 2022. We cannot be spending our time chasing and tracking emails when we have workflow systems that literally will help you assess the criticality of a third party. You don't have to go down the full ESG route of assessing risks beyond your just survival risks when you're looking at an entity for, an entity that it's just not that important. But as it grows, especially you keep saying supply chain, as you talk about suppliers and their suppliers, you absolutely need to start using technology to bring that data together, to map your supply chain, and then understand the knock-on effects and the downstream inherent risks that you're taking on. And right now, with forced labor and the U.S. Forced Labor Act, it is just so critical that we start going to technology and pulling that data together. And there's just so much. And in terms of the overwhelming piece, I think using artificial intelligence, natural language processing type of systems that can help eliminate noise is really important.
Okay, let me change the focus just a little bit, because you talked about the Forced Labor Act, the Uyghur Act, and obviously in the United Kingdom we have their Modern Slavery Act. Several other countries have followed suit with similar legislation. FCPA, UK Bribery Act, Sapon-Deux in France, Clean Companies Act in Brazil have touched upon anti-corruption and anti-bribery. And so we have some legislation or regulation, I guess might be the better word, in place. So how do you see us being able to use those frameworks to do exactly what you just said? Let's look down our entire supply chain.
Yeah, they're actually a great framework. And that's kind of goes to that earlier point of you're likely already doing a lot of these things. And if you're not doing it already, you're going to be forced to do it right now as these acts become enforced. And so, when the board is asking you, well, what are we doing here? It's exactly that, is looking to see how can we map our supply chain. Some companies have been ahead of that game, and they've been asking those questions, asking their suppliers who they're using, and they've mapped it. But what they're missing is the risk component, is now assessing all of those vendors from a risk perspective and looking into the forced labor itself. It's something that Exiger has been very focused on. We have a tool called Supply Chain Explorer. You mentioned that we just launched, and it helps you by looking at import and export data. It helps you basically make those links of who has a relationship with whom. We also use DDIQ analytics, which is looking out in the open web of identifying those relationships. And these regulations are 100% forcing companies to start looking at these problems. And I think from a board perspective, what you can start doing is categorizing them as here's what we're doing for ESG. At the bare minimum, from a compliance perspective, we know that we have to meet these standards.
Erika, one of the things that I have heard you and your colleagues at Exiger advocate over the past few years is something along the lines of the following. So I grew up professionally in compliance, focusing on the FCPA and anti-corruption compliance. That forced us to look at the sales side, distributors, resellers, commission sales agents. Separate and apart from that was the supply chain or procurement. But what you guys have talked about and really tried to counsel the rest of us is this is third-party risk. It's not supply chain risk. It's not sales side risk. It's not business venture risk. It's third-party risk. And so I really wanted to ask you, is that message, does ESG really help drive that message further or stronger, that this is third-party risk and you have to have a risk management solution and a risk management strategy around all of your third parties?
I do think that is accurate. And I do think that ESG is helping with that, because risk really is in your entire ecosystem of who you touch. In the customer space, you would say that's the associated parties, right? Who are they attached to? And although there might be a limit of where you stop, for third parties, it is an extension of yourself. And you cannot say that one third party, you can say that one third party is more critical and may have a higher risk and is more likely to, hurt your brand in a way, especially from an ESG. It's really about the brand and your reputation. But I think it can be any third party. I think sometimes when I walk into buildings in New York City, I know that all of those people in the reception are from a security company. And I sometimes wonder, of how their labor practices are. Are they working triple shifts in a sense, and should have better rights there? And then I think about down the line, other third parties that you may be doing business with in other countries, and those countries that where child labor is maybe more acceptable. I mean, I think sometimes even like, I don't know, my grandmother, she was a child on a farm. And I feel like she was born literally to help on the farm. That is what, to a certain extent is child labor. She didn't get to go to school because she had to drop out to help on the farm. This is what's happening in other countries. You look at the agriculture business, and I definitely think that all of your theory, it's your entire ecosystem. You need to look at the entire ecosystem. Yes, do you need a triage? Absolutely. You do need to think about, and we probably started with those entities in the first instance because that was the best place to start. But now as we're looking broader and broader and we're bringing in our values, which is really where ESG comes in, and thinking about our future for our children's sake, we need to be looking at the holistic picture and holding those companies accountable. Asking those questions in questionnaires across your third parties is making a change. I believe that because I have been answering those questions. And when I'm asked the question, what does Exiger do for its community from a social aspect or an ESG aspect? I'm happy to say that we can answer that question. But I wonder, what is if we weren't doing that? We're not the biggest company. We can't be, spending millions of dollars and donating and whatnot. And so I think it makes me proud to say we can answer the question. I think other vendors will start thinking, I keep getting this question. What are we doing? Let's think about that and maybe even put a program in place. And hopefully those things are slowly but surely going to make the world a better place.
So let me pick up on some of your remarks around working conditions. And I was really intrigued by two of the examples you gave. One was when you walk into a building in New York and you see the security. The second was the example of your grandmother, potentially child labor on farms. And many companies, when they think about working conditions, they go to that second example. Well, overseas, it's a tradition that children will work on a farm or perhaps in other businesses. But ESG is working conditions for companies in America, for your subcontractors in America. And the example you gave about you walking into a building in New York City and seeing the security guards where you check in or go through security control is equally important. Do companies understand ESG is not an international initiative, that ESG includes working conditions and everything else you've talked about for your subcontractors here in America as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I was yesterday at a Just Capital event, and these were the types of things that they were talking about, even more so than the global piece, which I think is interesting and important. I do think, though, the international piece is where all these countries are so different, and I just think that the cultural component that you speak to, I mean, was it yesterday Cadbury, was in the front page news because of the cocoa farms and, these 8-year-olds with these machetes that are like half their size. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. And, and then on this front page of Cadbury, you see that splash saying, everything that they're doing to make sure that there is no forced labor in their supply chain. I'm just wondering, do they even know that this farm is within their supply chain? And I like I said, those statistics were interesting to me because we are just at the beginning and we're asking these questions, we're having these podcasts, and I think we need to do both. Right now, we've been very focused on ourselves. We need to be asking those questions of our vendors, not just for policy, but also getting some verification. Can we do some screening on those entities to see what has happened in the past? Are they showing the track record? All those components. Certifications are also really important.
I have to say, you have given me some great phrases. And when I can use your phrase in a comment, we get double gold stars. So, do they even know? And you use that around Cadbury, talking about, do they even know that child labor is going on. And I really wanted to use that phrase to bring up the topic of supply chain and third parties is more than just your direct counterparties. So in the anti-corruption world, you look at those who are selling for you, but you tend not to look beyond that. And in supply chain, you may have 5 parties down the line. So I wanted to really use that question, do they even know, to bring up the topic of how do companies begin to look at their entire supply chain, not just those they have direct contracts with, but those 4th, 5th, and perhaps even 6th party contracts all the way down the line. And how do you have that discussion with a client or potential client?
Yes. So it's a really good question. I've been receiving different perspectives from prospective clients and clients of thinking, what do I have to do? And I'm always thinking, oh no, we're starting with what do I have to do? If we start there, then chances are you may not go as far as you probably should, because when you feel like I need to know and I want to know because I care, you'll go that much further. So the 2 ways that I've seen companies do this is, one is by asking their suppliers or their vendors, who do you do business with? And then, through Exiger being kind of a data aggregator and due diligence company where we're pulling so much information, we try to kind of validate some of that information through data. So import and export data is fantastic. There's no disputing if that transaction occurred. You can see even what is happening. I know that companies, and they talk about this all the time in these meetings, it's like, well, you can block out who you do business with. I'm like, you'd be surprised. You block out one thing, but you miss out on another piece. And if you're a company like Exiger, you can scour that information and still tell a pretty good picture, even the point of where things are coming from, right? So you don't need to necessarily know the entity name if you know it's coming from the Xinjiang region of China. So there's a lot of information in the import-export. There's a lot of information in terms of announcements. Companies are constantly announcing their partnerships. If they do business in certain countries, sometimes they have to, and the governments in those countries, they sometimes have to disclose who their subcontractors are. This is all amazing information that we can bring in to a system and then verify what you're hearing from your companies. Or you can start there and say, I'm seeing all these things. Let me start asking more questions. And that is really, we have an investigations arm at Exiger. And the one thing I've learned, I'm an auditor in background. And so bringing those 2 aspects together of just peeling that onion and asking another question of getting to the bottom of it, mapping that supply chain is the number one way to really see if you're able to meet those standards that from a compliance perspective, as well as, as a company and values perspective.
So for the companies that actually want to do more than they, quote, have to, end quote, and they make the decision, we're going to go all the way down the line to see what we know or what we can find out. What's intrigued me, Erika, is many of them have come back and even publicly said, this exercise has made us stronger from a business perspective because we now know where our risks are, not simply in modern slavery or anti-corruption or working conditions, but the pinch points where we might be shut down, where transportation might become an issue, where getting something across the border because of tax and customs may present risks we weren't aware of. And so that they feel like from the business perspective, it's actually made them more efficient. Are you beginning to hear those types of conversations, or have you been engaging in those kinds of conversations all along?
It's actually funny because we definitely started with that piece. During the pandemic and all the issues, we just realized, wow, companies don't know their supply chain. They didn't realize that everything was pointed to China or everything was pointed in one direction. There was one healthcare company further along in the pandemic, so they started having a little bit more view, and we helped them illuminate to notice that all their entities and their suppliers were all pointing at one company, one manufacturer in India. They thought they had alternatives, all these alternative suppliers, but they all pointed to the exact same company. And so then what I said was like, well, there's a big aha moment. We need to start really focusing on the economic risks of India in this instance. To your point, if there is an earthquake or a tsunami, or where is it located? So 100%, we always started with let's understand our supply chain, because we want to see the macroeconomic impacts that may have. You want to be, from a competitive advantage perspective, the first to be in the know. So if you have a manufacturing site in a certain region of the world, you want to be the first to know if there was some sort of weather issue, a climate issue, a geopolitical issue, transportation, like you mentioned, or even a pandemic, hotspot in the moment, and then know how to quickly react. And that has been the number one reason to why we've been engaging in terms of supply chain risk assessments. And now, having had those conversations and already talking about that mapping, bringing in ESG has been that much easier. And I think that goes for any new risk. I don't think ESG is just going to be ESG. It's like any of these acronyms we start adding letters and letters. Yesterday, I know leadership could go into governance, but really leadership is such an important component of everything in ESG, and it almost could deserve its own letter. And so the more information in terms of where things are, who those companies are, all of this kind of like biographical information, you can then start layering on the risk question, any risk that you're interested in, but you need to have that framework and understanding of where and the mapping, I think, in order to create that picture.
You mentioned earlier Supply Chain Explorer, and I wanted to ask you about the Supply Chain Risk Detection Platform, if you could perhaps say a few words about that.
Yeah, so thank you. The Supply Chain Explorer is super exciting. It's our new product that we've launched. And what it allows you to do is, in a pretty quick, instant click, you can look into any entity in the world's supply chain. But what we've done at Exiger is we've layered on the risk piece. So all of the entities within the platform also will have a watch list hit attached to it, if there are any, which will give you then a very quick view to say, oh, wow, this entity has this supply chain, and down the line, there appears to be some risk. Let's look into that. Let's do some more due diligence. Ideally, it is to use it as you're onboarding new suppliers so that you can mitigate any kind of risks before they're in the door. However, it could also be really helpful if you are doing an investigation or you just want to see how supply chains are changing. Even if you were to ask your suppliers who they're doing business with, Supply Chain Explorer, through all the data that it's gathering, will give you a notification, a new entity they're doing business with, and especially if there's risk attached to that entity.
Erika, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on Exiger or really any of the topics we've touched on in this podcast. What would be the best way for them to do so?
So you can definitely go to Exiger.com. There's a lot of information about what we do as well as how to get in contact with us. But I'd be happy to take anyone's email directly at epeters@Exiger.com. And if you're interested in your supply chain, you can access an early free trial of Supply Chain Explorer in May if you sign up through our website.
Well, Erika, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Tom.